Welcome to this beloved Lit in Colour Pioneers event. My name is Rosanna Amaka. I am the author of The Book of Echoes. The Book of Echoes is narrated by an enslaved African woman who arrives in the London docks and loses a child. She roams the earth trying to find her children. And in the process, she comes across Michael, who's based in Brixton, and Ngozi, who's based in Nigeria. When I was asked to come and do this event, I was told that there were some similarities between the two books, and I was deeply honoured that I was asked to interview Patricia. Both books cover history and the connections of enslaved African people, except the Book of Echoes comes at it from a British perspective. Lit in Colour is a campaign that the publishers Penguin runs in partnership with race equality think tank, the Runnymede Trust. Lit in Colour is all about supporting schools to make the teaching of English more inclusive of writers of colour. Lit in Colour Pioneers pilot is supporting 93 schools who changed their GCSE and A-level to Pearson's Excel's specification, which enables students to study set texts by writers of colour. And one of those texts is Beloved, first published in 1987 by the late Toni Morrison, who was a prolific African-American writer. Today we have Patricia Cumper with us, an award-winning playwright who adapted Beloved for a BBC Radio 4 play. We're going to be talking about how she approached the text, its main themes, and what Toni Morrison wanted us as readers to take away from it. Please remember there will be Q&As after our conversation, so please get your questions ready. Welcome, Patricia.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Okay. Beloved is a text that's set during the American Reconstruction era, just after the end of the American Civil War in 1865, and prior to the Jim Crow laws being brought in 1877, and marks a period of real progress for many Black Americans before Jim Crow brought in segregation. So please, for those watching, can you give a brief overview of what Beloved is about?
Oh, that's huge. It's a ghost story and it's a love story and it's a historical set piece. So it's all of those things. So my very briefest summary would be that Setha has escaped from those, it's set in Cincinnati, and she's escaped from her owner, crossed the river into free country with her children. She sent some of them before and she's waiting on her husband to join her. He never comes. And she has to make a life alone with her mother-in-law and her children. But when that life is disturbed by the arrival of the slave catcher who is coming across the river to take her back and her children back into slavery, she makes a dreadful decision about what she's going to do with her children. She will not allow them to go back into slavery. But there is also the fact that one of the men from the plantation she used to live on, called Sweet Home, arrived at the house, and they find a way, with all their pain and history, to have a romance. And the ghost story is that a strange woman, child, washes up on her doorstep who seems to have no neighbor and is fascinated by Setha. And she is, Setha thinks, the ghost or the re-embodiment of the child that she had to make that terrible decision about. And as this child becomes more and more angry in the household, they have to face more and more of that dreadful past. It's so complex. I think that's the best I can do.
Well, you've done very well. The question that I've got is, you adapted this for a play. What aspects of the novel were easy to adapt and what aspects were hard and why?
All right, the easiest thing to adapt was the actual dialogue itself. Toni Morrison is an absolute genius at writing dialogue, because what she does, and playwrights and like me adore, is that she works with text and subtext. And within what she writes, there is the intended a meaning for the characters, but there's also the writer's meaning, and that flows underneath it. And so as I was adapting it, it was really easy to create character to the dialogue that she wrote. The most difficult thing about it was a very, very strong note from Toni Morrison's publisher that said, you may not change the structure, because as you read it, there's a modern narrative, which is the love story and the arrival of the ghost woman child. And then there is the backstory of what happened before that. And I began to realize, as I was trying to untangle that actually they join together. That what is the beginning of the modern day story is actually what we hear at the end of the story in the past. So if you can pull them apart and then rejoin them, you get one long, beautiful narrative. But she's interwoven them in such a way that as somebody who is creating, I had to create 10, 15-minute episodes because it went out over a woman's hour over 2 weeks. And yeah, to find those moments where you can actually create something that is both in the present and in the past, that structurally it was extremely challenging. But oh, the dialogue is beautiful. And the other thing about it is, of course, that it's strongly visual. And I was allowed to use a narrator, which was essentially Toni Morrison's voice. And the descriptions that they have are so brilliant and so devastating that I felt tremendously lucky, but it was intensely challenging. And I think at the end of it, I probably had to lie down for a week because it was emotionally, and I mean, you must know this as well, when you're writing about this period of history, the emotions that it brings up, the anger and the pain and everything else are things that you have to deal with. And I think that having to work with the text like that was one of the things that I also had to figure out how I was going to carry the pain that was carried in the book.
Yeah. It is a difficult text to read, particularly viewing it from a mother's point of view and wondering, the actual story of not just being enslaved, but this enslaved woman getting to the point and knowing that it's based on real fact, getting to the point of actually feeling that it's better that her child dies than lives because of the horrific trauma that they went through. It's it's very powerful.
And yet you have lovely moments. Sorry, go
ahead.
No, I was just saying you have lovely moments. For example, when Paul D and Beloved and Seth's other daughter, they all go to a fair and they have a really good time. And their shadows mingle as they walk, and you can see that they are becoming a family. And they're just glorious moments like that. And then, as you say, they're deeply, deeply painful moments that, yes, where you as a mother, it absolutely resonates, and you have to take a deep breath before you can begin to consider the decisions you had to make.
Yeah. There are many different complex layers to this story. And at times, as you said, it's very challenging. What do you think the main themes of the novel are?
Oh, that's huge. Oddly enough, like most books, it's a story about love and what love can become and how love can be twisted and how love expresses itself in all sorts of different situations. I think that's a main theme. For me, certainly reading it and adapting it, it's just the sheer power of women. I mean, it's not that it denigrates men, but there is something about the way in which the women in it fight for their lives, create lives, continue to endure. That is just absolutely astonishing, but it's also something that I recognize from the lives that I've seen around me. So I think those two. There's also a really honest telling of history. And, everybody kind of knows a big picture of slavery and exploitation and rape and all of that. She manages to use small indignities to explain to you how awful it was. For example, that there's a woman who has just given birth to a child or is about to give birth to a child. She has her milk stolen by young men who think it's funny to do so. And the indignity of that is somehow almost more, it goes deeper with the reader than sometimes when you hear about, the cherry tree of scars that she has on her back, etc., etc. Because those are almost cliche, whereas the way she talks about the pain and the humiliation actually resonates on a very clear individual level.
Yeah, she wasn't even allowed to keep that for her child.
Yes.
In what ways can Toni Morrison's novel express the truths of this era better than other media such as history books, contemporary journalism, and official reports?
I think it's the clarity with which she draws relationships. You know, there's a part of the book where she's escaped. She's on her own. She's very pregnant. She's, you know, really on the edge. And she meets a young white indentured servant who's running away to try and find Pretty Velvet Ribbon. And there are wonderfully intense personal moments where, without the kind of hierarchy of power that race would have complicated it, they're both on par. And you see friendships beginning to emerge. You know, the fact that somebody like Paul D, who has been enslaved, who has escaped, who has been imprisoned, who has seen every humiliation, can rebuild himself enough to offer himself as a partner. Again, that the fact that love can overcome all of this and begin to build a life and build a family. So yeah, I think the relationships and the fact of love, and actually history is a context and it is one of the drivers of the drama, but thematically, I think love, human resilience, and relationships, to me, are the things that interest me, and I think are the things that drive the narrative forward.
Definitely. What I liked, you talked about the indentured woman that helped her give birth. What I liked about that is that it also gives a little bit of a window into other histories as well, other than the enslaved people. So it gives you not just a context of the Black Americans, but also what was happening in the rest of America as well, and what that period meant to other people as well. So yeah, I really liked that. So as we said, Beloved has a complex narrative structure. Toni Morrison experiments with a non-linear form. So she uses flashbacks to retell early events and deliberately breaks up the narrator's story, which... So what do you think, why do you think Morrison chose this particular narrative structure to tell her story?
I really, you know, the thing that comes to me, and this may not have anything, I may be completely wrong on this, but I think she almost wanted to juxtapose the awful with the possible, you know, in a way that the modern story, for all its, you know, moments of horror, actually has hope in it, you know, has the odd moment of love and kindness and all of that, whereas the story of Sweet Home, I love the irony of that name, the living on the plantation Sweet Home, was much darker and much more painful. And I think if we just had an unadulterated narrative of that, I don't think anybody would have stayed with the story long enough to get to the slightly lighter, to the slightly more interesting times. So I don't know, I mean, to me, that's what it meant. Occasionally it meant I could come up and breathe, you know, and see other aspects and other characters. I mean, she's got wonderful people like Stampede, who is the man who helps escapees across the river. And then you have Baby Suggs, who is her, I think it's her mother-in-law, who holds these wonderful church services in the middle of nature and calls on everybody to rejoice. And I think it's that juxtaposition of the absolutely awful with the wonderful, you know, and the wonderful in the ordinary that I think she's deliberately doing. But I think there's also, and I may be, again, maybe completely wrong about this, there is I think before Morrison, there was a sense that any narrative about this era had to be almost linear. It had to be sort of brutal and straightforward. And what she's done is say, no, this is my subject, but it is not who I am as an artist. And she's created a work of art. And she's gone into the supernatural, and she's talked about all sorts of other things that people would have said, no, you're a Black writer. Your only job is to write about pain. And she's saying, no, absolutely not. I am an artist, and this is my subject. So I think for me, those are the things that pop out. And she may, you know, rise up from the grave and tell me I'm completely wrong, but that's what, you know, came across to me.
Definitely. I liked the way that she did that, but it also gives you, and I thought it also gave you an idea of the difference between the two eras. So the Reconstruction era, which was a much more positive era, and there was a lot more hope and there was a lot more progress for Black Americans in that time, before Jim Crow came in, of course. Juxtapositioned against, as you said, the awful period, which was slavery. So yes, I agree with you totally. And but it also gives you that idea of what it was like for those people after slavery as well, during that Reconstruction. There was
Yes.
hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. Okay, so the thing that I remember when I first read this text as a young woman is particularly coming from my background. So the thing that really struck me was beloved, and particularly the supernatural. So, for instance, in UK, we would consider her to be maybe a spirit or a ghost, but I saw her as Obanje.
Mhm.
um, and it really struck me because I recognized her straight away. So she was a mixture of two things from African mythology for me.
Mhm.
One was Obanje, which is covered in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And
Mhm.
Obanje is children who die that come back to give grief to their parents. But there was also the other African mythology of the Mami Wata,
Mhm.
which is it's so beloved has many characteristics of the Mami Wata. So
Yeah.
she comes from the water. She requires gifts of delicious food and drink. And she sometimes disguises herself as a beautiful, sexually promiscuous woman. And I
Mhm.
saw all those things in that book, and I
Yes.
connected.
Yes.
And all of those things. And then when Beloved starts to talk about the Middle Passage,
Yes.
I read it and I thought this comes straight from what she's trying to tell me is that some of the religion, some of the that came from Setha, because I think Setha's mother was directly from Africa,
Yes.
that came directly from Africa through Beloved into Black America. And it just blew me away when I read that passage because I saw the connections.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, from my Caribbean side, I also saw Beloved as a mermaid. So there's
Mm.
some mermaid stories that are in there.
Mhm.
How did you see Beloved?
Oh, that's really interesting. Um, Oddly enough, not the way the film portrayed her.
Mm-hmm.
There was I grew up in Jamaica. The fact that people exist in another dimension and pop back and forth has never been a strange concept. I have to control it in my writing here because people think this is a really weird thing. But we've always had that sense that there is another space, another place that people come back and forth. I have a grandmother who raps me on the head every now and then and says, "Come on, do better." So I had a real comfort with the fact that she was there. I thought, particularly towards the end when she became hungry or pregnant or she just became bigger and more,
Mm-hmm.
that was that was new to me. That was something that I hadn't really come across in essence. The spiritual world tended to always to me to be a reflection of something that existed in the real world. So this clearly was something, above and beyond that. But the idea of spirit beings, of exorcism, we have, rolling calf and river mama and all of these
Mm-hmm.
sukiya, all of these creatures who essentially live in another dimension and then appear in ours. This that she gave that creature that ability to become almost monstrous is
Mm-hmm.
something that I hadn't seen before. And I found that one of the more riveting but also more difficult concepts to come to terms with, really, towards the end of the book.
Yeah. That, as I said, as a young woman reading that, knowing about Mummy Water, knowing about Obanje, and then also hearing stories from my grandmother on the other side about mermaids, etc., that I kind of just felt that Toni Morrison was speaking to me, definitely. But having grown up, I started to look at it slightly differently. And I started to read more about Toni Morrison and her background, etc. And I understand that she was an editor
Mhm.
in Penguin. And I also understand that she also edited a lot of, she did a collection of stories by a lot of African writers, such as Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka.
Yeah.
And I started to wonder how much is beloved from African mythology that traveled through the Middle Passage through into Black American culture, and how much is this ideas that were shared amongst writers that came through into the writing? I don't know if you know, or you can.
You see, I've been writing all my life in various ways. Sometimes I work on other people's work, sometimes I do my own. And I've come to the conclusion that most writers are what I call piccolo. They're magpies. They see a beautiful idea, they see a character, they see something that's gorgeous and shiny, and they pick it up and they put it into their story. So I don't think you're ever going to see any pure sort of adaptation from anything. I think what you're always going to see is something that swerves and changes with time, but takes the energy from other cultures and other stories. And I think there was a really active exploration, I think, by her and her contemporaries of those connections. I can't, it's so difficult to explain to people now that, you can just Google a country and find out stuff about it. When in the 60s and 70s, that was not possible. If you weren't actually visiting there or talking to somebody from there. I mean, if you read Maya Angelou's travels in North and West Africa, you begin to see how difficult it was for people to learn. So for me, I think it's that kind of fascination with a continent that gave you history and presence, but also a slight mysticism, that it is this other place. And I think she would have drawn from all of that. I think every good writer is a magpie. They take the most beautiful, shiny things and they weave them into something a story that they want to tell.
Okay. So the next question that I've got is, we talked about the history, we talked about beloved, but what I found fascinating is about the imagery and the language that she uses and I don't know if you can comment on how she uses imagery and language for character development at all, and what you think.
Well, I mean, one of the saddest things about adapting it was I had to cut out quite a lot of that. But the good thing is that you're looking at a paragraph of Morrison's writing and you're having to only take a sentence, But I think the really important thing for me, and I don't know what it would be like for other readers of it, is that the novel was entirely visual. Every time she wrote about something, I could see the stable where the milk was stolen. I could see the kitchen where, the woman gave her the earrings that were her wedding present. I could see the cornfield, where they hid out in order to be romantic. I could see the house. It's entirely visual, and that is because of her use of language. And she also, it's everything. It's touch, it's smell, it's visual, it's auditory. The first scene, she's been walking through a field of weeds that have irritated her skin, so she's using water to cool it down, and that's the first time Paul D sees her. It's so visual. You can almost tell the temperature of it. You can smell the baking. And I think it almost flows around you. I don't know how to explain it other than that. I think the most visual moment, again, is Baby Suggs conducting that sort of worship of nature in this glade of trees and calling everybody forth. You can hear the singing, you can see the green, you can almost, it's almost as if you were there. So I think she's tremendously sophisticated in how she uses language. She's tremendously observant of how trauma expresses itself. So that she doesn't do, I'm going to do a slight digression, but at the moment when the mother makes a decision that her children are not to live in this world because it is too awful, she doesn't describe screaming or anything awful. She describes the accuracy of a hummingbird's bill just drilling away at her. And that simple, very sharp, repetitive thing is so much more expressive of the kind of pain and disassociation she was going through than any kind of much more conventional way of describing it. So for me, it's the visuals that she creates and the accuracy with which she observes the human condition, and also the kind of kindness there is in the way that she observes the real absurdity of the way we live.
Definitely. And there's so much humanity as well that comes through in her writing. She's just a wonder.
Yes.
A wonderful, wonderful writer. And she's left so much of a legacy for other people. Not just in the information that she puts across that she gives to us in her writing, but also, as you said, the imagery that she gives, and the humanity of who these people were. You go away. This is something that textbooks, that history books just can't capture, that she has captured in this book. That these were human beings that loved, that felt, that breathed, that that had wishes, that had wants. It's wonderful, and I feel so privileged to have read it more than once.
Well, I read it probably every 5 years, and each time I find something different in it, something else that resonates. For some reason, Stampede, the man who would pick up people who would come across, and then he would take them to a safe house, and this old man who just risks his life every time, and who took on the name Stampede because he knew that he had, it was his duty to do this. It just grabs you, but different thing grabs me every single time that I read it.
Definitely. I've just been asked to tell you that I'm having issues with my internet, so please just listen to our conversation and just maybe not pay attention to the internet because it keeps freezing.
Yes.
Finally, one of the questions that I had is, what would you like the students to take away from this text? One, from your experience of reading it, but what do you think are the most important things that students should take away from this text?
I would love them to respect the craft, just the sheer craft of what she's done. She's created a work of art here. And I think that is tremendously important to me. I think if they have the time and patience, to just look at the way she structured it and how clever that is. And perhaps maybe use that as a model for something that they want to write in a different way. But the fact that you can take structure and then you can pull it apart and you can reassemble it, and the story doesn't lose anything for the fact that you've changed the structure. But and this is going to be something I'll say because it's a function of my age. But when I was learning to write, this was in Jamaica, we'd have American teachers come down and they basically say to us, if you want to write, make sure you have a white character in there so that they can navigate the audience into the story. That is not the case with Beloved. There was never a need for that. And I think the kind of the fact that in its own way, yes, it's a love story, yes, it's a ghost story, yes, it's beautifully crafted and it's a work of art, but it was also revolutionary in the fact that it centered the experience of Black women in this way, as people and as characters.
Wonderful. So I would like to thank you, Patricia Cumper, for your time today. It's been a privilege to be here to interview you about this wonderful book. And I wish all the teachers and the students studying the text luck. And I hope they enjoy the experience of reading Beloved. And Beloved is a book rich, as we said, in imagery, in language, in history, in African mythology, in humanity, and it provides an opportunity for us to open a window to the past, to try to understand on a human level what it was like during that era. And in doing so, offers us an opportunity in understanding ourselves and the world we live in a little better. Thank you. We're now going to open up some questions from the audience. So we have a Q&A session. And the first question that we've got here is, what drew you to Beloved? In particular, do you have any personal experiences that made it particularly enticing?
Oh, is that for me or for you?
For you.
What to tell the truth, I first met Beloved when, again, living in Jamaica, so a long time ago, I was taken on a tour of several American cities to meet with other writers. And there was a professor of literature in Ohio who said to me, "You must read this book." And I said, "Yeah." And she gave me the book and I put it in my suitcase and I thought, eh. And I got to Jamaica and I read this thing and I could not put it down. And so it's been kind of a part of my life for an awfully long time. What's interesting for me, I guess, is that a lot of the pain in it didn't register with that first reading. It was just sheer excitement. And the older I get and the more often I read it, the more the sort of anger at the futility of the pain in it, I think, probably emerges more and more. But no, initially it was because I was told by a really sort of sensible person, "You must read this." And it absolutely changed my life as a writer. And it made me rethink the way that when you're writing, making history context and being brave enough to bring to the fore love stories and ghost stories and all the other wonderful things that writers can play around with.
Wonderful. The next question that I've got is, do you think that gender makes a significant difference for slaves?
Whoa. Now you're getting into history. If I'm going to be completely blunt, there are different legacies, I think, from slavery for the genders. I do think that men were essentially seen as brutes and strong, and family structures were entirely broken in order to be able to move them around. And I know that certainly from the history in Jamaica. I think women essentially, because we are the bearer of children and because the bearing of children created additional wealth, we were probably treated slightly differently. I certainly know from Jamaican history that we were allowed to have what were called polinks. We could have and sell vegetables and so on. We could negotiate slightly different relationships. So there is a lot in our history where the gender does make a difference. And sometimes it's reflected in the relationships that we have now. I certainly come from a family of very powerful women. You know, it's, and most of we've had a woman prime minister in Jamaica. There's an awful lot that I know, most of my Black women friends, whether it's a curse or a blessing, are women who get on with it, you know, and who take an awful lot of responsibility and move forward. So there has been an effect between history and gender. Whether we've even begun to resolve it now, I do think so. Somehow, in historical terms, this is all still quite recent. But yes, I think gender is important, and that Beloved gave female characters agency. It didn't dominate. I mean, the love story between Setha and Paul D was just wonderful, and the allied models of allyship that it showed were wonderful. But yes, I think it was important. The matter of gender and how it has affected people differently is heightened in this, and I think it is important.
Yeah. And the experiences, as well as you said, are different, but also that we must remember that most slaves that were taken were originally male. So I think the majority of slaves that came through on the Middle Passage, more males were taken than women, because, as you said, they were seen to be more profitable in terms of work. Yeah. But yeah, so everybody doesn't come out of it well, either gender.
No. I mean, there are still, I think, cultural and social, I wouldn't call them scars, but aspects of it that we are, as we heal and as we grow and as we become more of ourselves, we have the strength to look at and to begin to deal with.
Yeah. Next question. Do you think your books are suitable for, well, it says your books, but I don't think that Toni Morrison is here to answer that. So I'm going to answer it in terms of my books. So
yes.
Do you think your books are suitable for study for KS3 students around the age of 14? Ooh. In terms of Beloved, I think it's suitable, but I don't know whether they'll be developed enough to take in many of the issues that it has. I don't know what you think, Patricia.
I think that's difficult because at 14 you could be a 14 going on 12, and you can be 14 going on 18. It's
Yeah,
just, it's quite a precious time. And
yeah,
I would probably have I would have made it a little later, but I'm sort of old fashioned because I do think there's some very deep traumas. The
yeah,
moment of revelation of Seth's actions is shocking.
yeah. I think a little bit older, as you said, mainly because of the trauma that's in it, and the processing of that trauma and what it all means. But I'm not a KS3 English teacher, so
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough to really answer that with any expertise.
Mhm. But in terms of my book, The Book of Echoes, again, I would say that yes, that I think a 14-year-old could read it. But in terms of processing the trauma and really processing the information in it, because as I said, there's similarities between The Book of Echoes and Beloved, but the Book of Echoes comes from it more from a modern point of view. That's one. And two, the historic aspect of it is more about the British slavery and what they did, and it starts in 1803. So from that aspect, I think that it would be good for a 14-year-old to find out the British information on slavery. So yeah, but I do think that maybe a little bit older to process the trauma.
Yeah, it's tough.
Why was this text so revolutionary at the time it was published? I'll give that to you because I think you've
Well,
already
yeah,
said a
I
few
think
things.
it basically is that it placed at the center of it a Black woman's voice, a voice that and it made the characters central as well. It's not just necessarily the voice of the writer, but it made those characters central. But it also, I think, was I don't know how sophisticated in the way that it dealt with all of those things. It was not apologetic about anything. It was a fresh view at the time. And I think if you look at some of the contemporary writing, you'll see that in fact what she did was was to give space to voices and characters that had always played peripheral role. It's like taking, what was her name, Hattie Daniels, and making her the star instead
Yeah.
of the lady on the side going, yes, ma'am. If she became the star, that's what Beloved did. It took the talented people, wonderful people on the periphery, and put them at the center of the story and said, I dare you to tell me to take them out.
And
And
made
what
them
happened?
human.
Oh, absolutely. Beautifully human and flawed and gorgeous and all of those things. And I think that's what it was. It was just shoving things from the margin to the center and absolutely taking center ground and saying, I am a writer of wonderful prose, and these are the characters that interest me. I remember watching an interview with her, and somebody said to her, when are you going to start writing about white characters? And she said, would you ever ask a white writer when you're going to start writing about Black characters? Don't do that. She knew her ground, she knew her characters, and she knew how revolutionary she was being, and she did it anyway.
She was a powerful woman.
Yeah, yes, yes.
Do you think we in the West are uncomfortable about the intangible world of spirits? If so, why?
Well, it depends. I mean, if you're into Wicca, there's a whole other tradition of druids and Wicca and all sorts of other things, Ouija boards and whatever else.
Yeah.
But I do find that certainly the work I've tried to do in theater and elsewhere, that if you write somebody who's comfortable with seeing spirits or being that it's seen as unsophisticated, it's seen as primitive. And I think essentially when you talk about matters literary and theatrical, you're essentially talking middle class. So I think that has a lot to do with it. But in fact, every society that you can think about has some sort of conversation with the mystical. I don't know whether it's you get drunk enough to do see pink elephants, or you take a bit of peyote or whatever it is. But there's always been that sense that the world is more than we can see. And I think
Mhm.
I think the whole discomfort is that it was necessary, I think, in order to justify the profits of the slave trade, for you to feel that anything that came from Africa was crude. Therefore, if this kind of belief, this kind of language comes from there, therefore, you have to find a way to say that it's less. Because if you say that it is equal to us, then you've admitted that you have exploited and murdered and people who are your equal. So there's a whole huge historical backdrop to the way in which these things are seen. But yes, that it just depends. Like I say, there are traditions of the spirit world in every society, but it depends who your gatekeepers are, who your arbiters are.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Didn't Charles Dickens write about the ghost world in Scrooge?
Yes, yes,
But
and ghost stories and Ouija parties and all of those things have always been, you know, fire and brimstone preachers with, you know, the mouth of hell. And of course, all the Greek and Roman myths and, you know, had to do with portals between different worlds, whether it was the gods above or, you know, hell below. So yeah, it's always been there. But I think sometimes things are labeled because
comes from other.
yeah, yeah, they have to be other, because if you make them your own, then you have to admit some other things as well.
Why do you think Toni Morrison was not scared about writing about such heavy topics?
I think because she was living the consequences of it. I think she also lived at a time when there were an awful lot of revolutionary women, Audre Lorde and Angela Davis with the famous Afro, and you know, all of those people. These ideas were being really pushed, you know. And you think about coming on from Martin Luther King and all the other ideas that were being examined. There was an intellectual tradition that she was part of, but she took it to the creative level rather than it being sort of polemical or any of the other choices she had. She decided that she was going to make it fiction, write this novel. And Beloved isn't her first. It's the one at which her pen is the sharpest. I can't remember, but there are definitely ones before that. You know, the Sula and the Bluest Eye and all of these things. But this, it was almost as if they were warming up, and she got to Beloved and she went, this is, I'm here, listen to me now. And I think just that confidence, that power, but it's harder, it's hard one.
It's a good question that I would actually like to ask her, because we assumed that she wasn't scared, but sometimes you can be scared, but just do it anyway.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
Could you spell the names of the African mythological characters you mentioned and tell us a bit more about them?
That's you.
Yeah, that's me. Okay, so I was talking about Obanje. So if you read Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, he talks about Obanje in there. So it's spelled Ogbanje. So Ogbanje. And it's been mentioned in other African writers' work as well. The other is Mami Wata, which is a West African. In the West, you might call her the mermaid. So she's a little bit like the mermaid, and that's spelled Mami Water, Water. So. And I think you mentioned, you yourself mentioned a character about.
Yes, we call her River Mama.
Yeah.
And she comes out of the river and she's entirely seductive, and she goes back into and she has a golden table. When the golden table rises, then all the riches are there if you can capture it. But that's, yeah, we have a River Mama as well. There's always a spirit of the water, isn't there?
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Always female too.
Yeah. Beloved can be a difficult text for some students to navigate. Do you have any tips regarding how this complex novel can be made more accessible?
Well, actually, there's a 10-part dramatization, which brings it all down into, I don't know. I mean, the film might be an interesting way to introduce it, because that's very much a truncated version of it. I think certainly when I was studying something at that age, I would always go for a précis first, so that I understood the structure of it, a little bit about the characters before I started actually reading it. It may well be about instructions. You literally, you take a couple of chapters or a particular incident, you have a look at that, and then you move on to the next. She's particular about her structure. She wants you not to mess about with the structure. So, but yeah, I think also it might be useful to get them to write some sort of response to what it is they're reading. So even if they're not particularly understanding it at the moment, they can do some sort of response to it. And as the book builds, they can see whether or not this fits with the story that they're trying to tell. But yes, it's beautiful and it's difficult. And sometimes, it's just to give them enough space to just let it wash over them and let them take what they can from it and leave it. Because if they go back to it, they'll take something else.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Beloved is a malevolent spirit or a good soul?
I don't think she's either. I don't think she hasn't been born yet. She's not fully formed.
Mm-hmm.
She like a child, when she's hungry, she screams. She wants affection, she wants love. When she's angry, she swells up, but that she can't continue to live in the world, or her presence in the world destroys efforts to move forward, are pretty much, the symbolism of it. But no, I would never say good or bad. I think like she says, she's sad.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sadness in the spirit in that house, and there's a sadness in the hunger for her mother, and the way that she forms a friendship with her sister and then pushes her away when she thinks she's not getting enough attention, and tries to seduce Palsy away from her mother. There's a sadness and a hunger in it, and I would not say it's neither good nor bad. It just is.
Yeah, it's oversimplistic to put her in one box or the other. She's basically it almost feels, well, as I said before, that if she is from the Obunje side, then she basically is a child that gets reborn and comes back to cause grief to her parents or family. But there is a sense in the book, in the text, that she's really upset.
Yes.
She's acting out. Yeah. But in an extreme way.
Extremely, and a childlike way as well. I want my mother, and nobody else must get in the way. Yeah.
Yes. How would you best advise students to process the trauma detailed in Beloved and Book of Echoes during a time when trauma has been a part of their daily lives?
I think it is the fact that it works itself out and that it has an ending. It has a conclusion, and there is healing, and that avoiding it doesn't make it heal. Seeing it, understanding it, loving the people who have been through it, and then seeing the healing, that is an important process. You don't sit and wallow in it. And what I love about the way Morrison writes it, as I said, she goes through the humiliations and the entrapment and the lack of privacy. She doesn't go for the endless whips playing things. Do you know what I mean? She avoids the graphic in order to create the pearl. But I also think that to go through trauma is the way to heal. To avoid trauma and pretend that it doesn't exist creates an abscess. So for me, I think it's important to go through.
And I think in the text as well, there's as you said, because of the era that she's talking about, the Reconstruction era, there is real hope.
Yes.
There's real progress in that era. So as you said, because there is hope, and if you go through it, I think through reading it, I think it's a way of learning that there is a better tomorrow.
Yes.
And that helps.
Yeah.
Even though it is a difficult text, do you think it would still benefit? Do you still think it would be beneficial to read with KS3, even though they may not be able to understand all the concepts?
Ooh, I'm not a teacher. I don't know. I don't know. It just depends on who the children are, which, it might well just be.
And what their own trauma is.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it triggers something or it explains something.
Mhm.
Wow. But you see, I mean, we're talking about trauma as if this is a singular thing. I don't know any good
Mm.
drama that isn't essentially about, pain and catharsis at some point,
Yeah.
or, so, Dickens in his amazing books was talked about the
Mhm.
most awful
Yeah,
poverty.
Oliver Twist wasn't exactly.
Somebody got caught by a convict out on a, sent off. There was nothing gentle about any of those either. So I wouldn't back off from it
Mhm.
just because, there it deals with something painful and traumatic. But I would be careful not to mind the trauma, but allow them to take from it what they find interesting. Yeah.
I think it's important for teachers to actually read it themselves. They know their students, they know their school and what they're coping with, and they make that assessment appropriately.
Mhm.
You could say, yes, it's ready for, it's okay for KS, but you don't know. Each individual school is different, and
Yeah.
they know
Yeah,
what's appropriate for
that's
them.
way be above my pay grade, and I want to. I mean, children are so precious, you don't want to.
Mhm.
But I do think that there's much to be gained from it, but it's how it's used, I think.
Yeah. I think when you get to the A level stage, then they're old enough. But yeah, for KS3, I think teachers read and make your own assessment. An understanding of Aboriginal stroke African spiritual belief system is ideal when teaching this text in school. What other books would you best advise to read? Ooh.
Wow. No, I don't
I,
know.
I've given one, which is Things Fall Apart.
Chinua Achebe, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I was going to say The Famished Road, but then of course that also is, it requires an awful lot of sort of literary energy to kind of
Yeah,
absorb I mean, it's such a beautiful book, but you do
yeah.
have to. I think he doesn't make it easy for you. It's
No,
yeah.
he doesn't.
That's fascinating. Because do you want just to text tell something about how the spiritual beliefs work, or do you want something where it is contextual to the story? That's I can't give you a good answer to that one, I'm afraid, but I'm sure
Mhm.
there are. I'm sure Penguin publishes something.
Yeah. I think
That-
maybe we take this one offline and maybe give that to Penguin, and maybe they can send to the school a list if they really want that answer.
Mm.
I don't know what you think, whether that's a good way of handling it.
Yeah, I think so. I think do it sort of
Okay.
on an individual basis would be good.
Yeah. Can you talk more about the theme of water in the text?
Ooh. I suppose I'm trying to think of the many ways in which it's used. I'm not sure necessarily water, but liquid is used in an awful lot of ways. So you've got the taking of the milk, which I think is just such a very strong image. The fact that she is carrying a child and she can feel it moving in the amniotic fluid, that she's crossing a river, and that as she is having the child, she's also sinking into the river, so that her amniotic fluid and the river becomes sort of one fluid essence. It's that kind of lovely thought of we're all islands joined underneath. The water covers us, but in fact we're all connected underneath. But also water as cleansing, as she comes in with the sap all over her legs and she's itching and the water is looking to get rid of it. The fact that beloved arrives out of the water and she just, for the first while she's there, all she does is drink. I mean, she just wants water. So it's clearly water as life, water, the thing that connects us, the thing that makes us human. But I haven't really thought about it. I'd have to go back to the text and really look clearly at it. But she clearly sees water as something that both brings life, but connects, but is vital for life. That it's a place from which beloved comes. Is yeah, the fact that everything is connected by water, I think, is really interesting. But I don't have that luxury really. I just had to chop it up and make it up. But I think water is a hugely important thing. It uses it in a number of different ways, but it's very much powerfully a part. And maybe this is kind of her identification with, tell me if I say this correctly, Oshun, the sort of idea of woman and water and power and, you know, birth and all of those wonderful things that go with the idea of water.
Mm-hmm. But when I was reading the text, I thought in terms of water, water was escaped. So Sepha escapes through water, escapes using water. Paul D escapes when, you know.
Oh yes, his cell, the pity. Yes,
yeah.
I forgot that. Yes.
But I also saw it as water bringing trouble. So water brought beloved, water brought the school teacher.
Yeah.
So yeah, so there's different, it's both, as you said, healing and escape, but also bringing trouble.
Yeah, again, goes back to my childhood in Jamaica. If you dream water, if it's rough, then you have troubles coming. So, and if it's calm, it means that you'll overcome your troubles. So there's and I know that Toni was married to a Jamaican for a while. So maybe
Yeah.
I'm hoping that we've gotten there just a little bit.
I'm sure.
Not, you know. You always want to see yourself in things, don't you? It's so strange.
What inspires you both to write?
Well, I'll start, and then essentially I get irritated about things. I see a little injustice or something that I think is not right, and then it's a process of what I call embroidery. I begin to work out from, you know, if that becomes the climactic point of the story, how do I go back? But the other thing, of course, is that I will overhear dialogue, or I'll see a character, or something will interest me, and I'll think, oh, I want to do that. But I wrote a play about the Jamaican soldiers in World War One. And then all the research, and I found some really interesting characters. And the only time I could actually write the play was when I found the woman who was involved in the telling of the story. She ran a bar where all of these guys collided across class and all sorts of other things. And she's the one that was the catalyst for the conversation about the relationship between Caribbean and England, the war, etc., etc. So yeah, it's usually an irritation about something, but then it becomes a matter of just collecting, constantly collecting, you know, weaving, a bit like a spider, trying to get everything woven into a shape so that it, you know, it catches the imagination. So what is it for you?
It's wanting to find out more. So if there's an idea, an article or something that I've come across and it sparks my interest and I want to delve more and more and more, then that usually starts to spark, you know, inspire my writing. Yeah. Next question. What was your process like in approaching the adaptation itself? What parts did you really enjoy and what parts did you not enjoy as much?
Sometimes it boils down simply to there are two techniques I use. One of them is, once I've read the book first or second time, the things that I remember, the things that stand out to me, and I make a list of those because I know I want to include that. And then sometimes it's just as simple as page numbers. There's 250 pages. That means approximately 25 pages per episode. What do I get in that 25 pages? And then you kind of do an exploration from there. What I absolutely loved were trying to make the sound visual, or the visual sound work sound-wise. And the fact that I had this lovely narrator, so I could actually use Toni Morrison's work. What I found difficult was cutting some of it, not telling some of it, and cutting whole characters on. And I had a real difficulty with the end, and I'm not sure whether it's I just didn't want it to end, or I didn't quite believe the end. But that for me was the hardest to. Was the other episodes had sort of driven themselves along. That was the one I spent the most time trying to, trying to close off the story. So yeah, but it's always, it's painful. You have to rest after you've done it, but it's also wonderful to be in this world that's so vivid and beautifully expressed, and the language is glorious.
Well, that was the final question. And I'd like to thank you so much for all your answers. It's really wonderful to sit down and talk about. It's a privilege, and it's to actually sit down and talk about this novel with you. And I have admired you from afar. And I'd like to take this opportunity once again to thank the teachers and the students for being with us. And I hope and I wish that they will take a lot away from the text of Beloved and enjoy the experience of it. Thank you for being part of this, and I hope you get a lot out of it. Thank you.